2, 1. Talk Radio.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Yaron Brook Show on this Monday evening. I hope you're all having a great day, great evening. All right, a few topics I want to cover today. We're going to talk about George Bush Sr., who passed away a couple of days ago, and just a few comments on President Bush. And then gene editing. Gene editing is in the news big time. Chinese scientist is getting into serious trouble. Then we're going to talk a little bit about, given we're talking about China, we'll talk about trade, maybe Trump's deal with China or non-deal or deal or whatever. We can talk about a couple of Patreon topics that I didn't cover last week from my 10 favorite books on economics. We'll see. I'll give you a few books there. Was America, and then a question about the trajectory of American capitalism over the last 250 years. So that's the broad brush of what we're going to be talking about today. Of course, you can participate by asking Super Chat questions. There's a Super Chat feature in the chat. You press the $ at the bottom there. I guess you have to fill in some information, and you can ask a question. If you put up some dollars, put up some dollar bills associated with it. All right. Let's start with, George Bush. George Bush, President of the United States from 1988 until 1992. I moved to the United States in 1987. Reagan was still president, so I remember the election of George Bush. I particularly remember the election that George Bush lost in 1992 to Bill Clinton by a small margin. I think it was quite close. I think Bush came close to beating Clinton. History might have been different if that had happened. Who knows what would have happened? But what do we make of George Bush's legacy? I think at the bottom line is not much. Nothing much to talk positive about. This is the guy who gave us a famous line of no new taxes, read my lips. And then 2 years into his presidency, raised taxes. Partially because the feeling was the deficit was going out of control because of the fact that under Reagan, there was no budgetary discipline. Spending went out of control completely. And taxes had been cut while revenues had gone up. Spending had gone up much, much faster than revenues had. And even though the economy had done well, there was this massive amount of debt being built up. Hey, remind you of anything? Maybe of how things are going today. And the sense was that there was no option but to raise taxes. Bush raised taxes. Of course, Clinton raised taxes again. The economy continued to grow. The economy continued to do quite well. The link between tax cuts or tax increases and economic performance, for the most part, unsubstantiated, dubious. It is government spending, government regulation that ultimately determine the fate of the economy, much more so than the particular form in which taxes take and the particular rate in which they're taxed. As long as spending continues, long-term economic performance is not impacted much by tax cuts. So you have to do more than that. Of course, economic success is not necessarily harmed a lot by tax increases. For example, under Clinton, if government spending is placed under control, which it was under Clinton, we actually got to a point of balanced budget towards the end of Bill Clinton's presidency. So George Bush is remembered for raising taxes in spite of his pledge, read my lips, no new taxes. So he'll forever be remembered for that. I think for the most part he'll be remembered as kind of a nothing president who did nothing, stood for nothing, represented nothing, meant nothing. I think his whole career, that's what he stood for. That's what he represented. Nothing. The zeroing out of the Republican Party, the meaningless. They stood for there was no meaning to what they stood for. A little less statism than Democrats, but other than that, nothing really. A pragmatist, not a pragmatist like Trump, but a pragmatist, a non-ideologue, was proud of the fact that he was not ideological. People remember his foreign policy. What was his foreign policy? To defend the Saudis at all costs. He was a huge friend of Saudi Arabia, entrenched our interest with Saudi Arabia even more than it was before. The first Gulf War, which you know, arguably, why did we fight the first Gulf War? And if we did fight it, why didn't we finish it? Why didn't we actually do away with Saddam Hussein? Maybe that would have saved us the war later. Conditions were probably better in the early 90s to take out Saddam Hussein than they were when he was actually taken out in the mid-2000s. But you know, what's exactly the value of that war? It was a mess. It was exactly what you'd expect of a kind of a Bush war. You know, Saudi Arabia was our ally, our big ally for that war. Israel was not an ally, was sidelined during the war, took a barrage of missiles that it was not allowed to respond to. Just a you know, unhealthy Middle East policy that was, again, completely pragmatic, completely beholden to the Saudis and to the Arabs. So at every dimension, Bush was unimpressive human being. He was the head of the CIA. What is the CIA remembered for during the Bush years? Nothing. Maybe it's bad calls with regard to the Soviet Union. This is the period where the Soviet Union, where the CIA thought the Soviet Union was a real threat. Soviet Union economy was doing really well. Challenging the United States economically turned out to be completely false. Again, an era in which the United States got more enmeshed, more connected with the Arab world. So I have no respect for George Bush, the elder. I have no respect for George Bush, the younger. I think the Bush family has done this country a huge disservice by sending its kids to be presidents. I can't, I can't think of a family that's done worse other than of course, FDR. There were two of them, right? Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Teddy Roosevelt, two cousins. I think they were cousins, who maybe did the country more harm than Bush Sr. and Bush Jr. Completely emptied, again, American foreign policy, and completely emptied the Republican Party of all content. Kennedy's only supplied us with one president. The Clintons landed up only supplying us with one president. And I think on balance, both Bushes were worse than Bill Clinton. So I would take Bill Clinton's 8 years over George Bush Jr. or George Bush Sr.'s presidencies any day. So I'm not a fan, and I'm not mourning his death. I don't really care. Too bad he was president. Marianne Kent asks a question, a technical question. I don't know, on Super Chat, so I'll take it, but it's got 10 pounds attached to it. That, with a pound sinking every day, that 10 pounds is worth less and less and less every day. We might talk about Brexit if you want. Daniel Hannan has a good piece about Brexit in some newspaper. Where did I see it published? I've got it here, but I can't tell what newspaper it is. But a good piece about Brexit. But how do you move the NHS from where it is today to private medicine? Wow. So I think the best way to do it is by the use of something called medical saving accounts. And I think the way to do that would be for the UK government to start putting in every Brit's bank account. Give them the option. They can stay with the NHS and then they get the regular services that the NHS provides. Or instead of that, they can get a check that is deposited into a medical saving account, that they can use that check to do two things: to buy health insurance and to pay for private health services. Now, that will incentivize at least a certain percentage of the population to move out of the NHS and to start buying private health insurance. It will actually create, it will create a market for insurance, because the problem right now is there is no market for private health insurance. It's very small. The number of health insurance providers, that because of the number of buyers, is very small. But if you put this money into bank accounts, a certain percentage of the Brits will leave the NHS and shift to the private system, thus creating an incentive for insurance companies to enter the market. Over time, more and more people will be shifting away from the NHS. And over time, what you do is you start lowering the amount of money that the government puts into the medical saving account, but allowing individuals to put more and more of their own money into a medical saving account tax-free. That is, before taxes. So that you slowly start shifting the burden of actually paying for the insurance from the government to individuals. But the individual makes the decision about the insurance, and of course, in the process, you have to make sure that you don't regulate insurance companies. You don't do what the Americans do, which is regulate to death the insurance companies and the type of insurance policies that can be provided. And so you don't mandate anything. The only thing you mandate is, if you're going to use this money in your medical saving account, A, you're not going to be treated by the NHS, and B, you can only use it for healthcare. Okay? Somebody says here you would fund it by alcohol, cigarette, drug, and sugar taxes. No. I hate taxes like that. Hate any taxes that incentivize you to behave in a particular way. Keep the government out of the business of trying to incentivize my behavior. Keep them out. I don't care, right? No, you fund it through general revenue, and then you start minimizing it. You start reducing it over time as an insurance market is built up, and as people realize the benefits of private health markets. More and more people shift. You start reducing it. You might keep medical saving accounts funded by government for the very poor, right? For the very poor. Although that creates a kind of a negative incentive for the very poor to become wealthier. So you have to deal with the disincentives that you create by handing money to poor people, which already exist because of welfare. So that's how it would shift. And of course, as more and more money is going to private hands, as more and more money goes into private insurance companies, more and more hospitals shift to private practices, more and more doctors, enter private practice. I mean, the other thing you would have to do, and I know some of you are going to be horrified by what I'm going to say, is you're going to have to allow immigration of doctors into the UK, because you're going to have a shortage of doctors. You're going to have a shortage of doctors in the private sector, and there's a shortage of doctors already, and there's not the time it takes to go through medical school to get a new generation of doctors who are willing and able to work in the private sector, and where there are enough of them, there's enough numbers of them, is going to take a while. So you're going to have to loosen up whatever immigration controls might exist today to allow for more doctors into the country. So that would be the combination of things. I'm sure there are other things, like you would slowly have to privatize the hospitals. You would slowly have to privatize other medical other medical delivery functions to make them available to the private sector. And slowly prices would come down. Insurance would become bigger and bigger, more substantial, and its prices would come down, and it would drive more and more doctors, more and more entry into the into the field, which again would drive prices down, drive quality up. So that is what my prescription would be. What about the loss of efficiency of bulk buying of medical supplies? Who cares? There is no efficiency when there is one buyer, which is like the NHS, and it basically you want a competitive market. You want many buyers and many sellers, and the one buyer tends to have one seller. It tends to, yes, drive costs down, but also drive supply down and drive everything down. So costs might go up. I don't care about healthcare costs going up in the short run. Long term, on a quality adjusted basis, costs would come down. But I don't think people pay way too much attention to cost. I mean, I don't know what the right cost is for healthcare, how much we spend on healthcare. So yes, you would lose so-called efficiency by having one bulk buyer of drugs who can drive the cost of drugs down. But on the other hand, you'd pay market prices for drugs. And by paying market prices for drugs, you'd actually allow drug companies to have more profits, which would allow more R&D, which would allow more introduction of new drugs down the road into the pipeline. So there would be huge long-term benefits to actually reducing the idea of one buyer. All right. Okay, I'm not taking any more of those freebie questions. You want to ask a question or make a comment, go to the what do you call it? Super chat. And Mary, thanks for asking the question. If you have any follow-up, you know where to ask it. All right, we've got was Bill Clinton only successful because of Gingrich? Yeah, to some extent. We had divided government, not due to Gingrich, but because there was divided government. But Clinton was smart enough to cut a deal with Gingrich, and the deal that he cut was a deal that actually reduced spending. So instead of fighting Gingrich on spending, he actually cut a deal with Gingrich on spending, and actually Gingrich overplayed his hand by doing the government shutdown, which actually cost Republicans votes, and so I would give a lot of credit to Bill Clinton managing divided government well, something Obama didn't do. Obama had an opportunity. Obama had a deal with Republicans, and actually, again, I love divided government. Obama's deal with the Republicans also resulted in slowing down government spending, something that's gone out the window with Trump and Republicans controlling the House and the Senate, and won't be resurrected with Democrats holding. What I like, and I've said this often, and history suggests that from a fiscal perspective, from the perspective of government spending, the best combination, this is just empirics, the best combination is a Democratic president and a Republican House and Senate. And you saw that under Clinton, and you saw that again under Obama. Government spending was under control in those regimes. So Clinton was a pragmatist who used the hand dealt him to actually do a few good things. I mean, remember welfare reform. Welfare reform was something he could get passed with Gingrich's support and with a Republican Senate support. But he passed it. He didn't veto it. He actively engaged in getting it passed and actually got Democrats to vote for it. So again, a lesson learned. Republicans get nothing done legislatively. Look at the Trump administration, which has got nothing except tax cuts, which every Republican gets done, and which have minor economic value. Clinton got something done with Republicans, so he gets credit for that. All right, Unshelled Coast says, we talked about Iran-Contra today. Thoughts? Yeah, I mean, any deal with Iran was a bad deal. I think this was one of the low points of the Reagan administration. I think generally Reagan was very bad on the Middle East. I think his Secretary of State was a complete pragmatist. I think Bush being vice president, I mean, Reagan had no foreign policy other than with the Soviet Union calling them, whatever he called them, evil empire, which was very good. In terms of the Middle East, his foreign policy was very, very bad and mediocre. and any deal that favored Iran, like Iran-Contra, was a bad deal and should have never been done. Yeah, I mean, Reagan was bad on Iran, as of almost every single president. And of course, I think Reagan was also bad on Central America. But Central America, I think, poses less of a threat and posed less of a threat to the United States than what Iran has stood into, which was completely predictable back in the 1980s. And remember, in the 1979, Iran took the American embassy and took Americans hostage, which was an act of war, and yet Reagan forgave them for that, which is, again, unthinkable in my view. All right, let's move to second topic I had planned. Keep the super chat questions coming, keep the dollars flowing. It's really helpful. And those of you on Facebook who want to ask questions, you can go over to YouTube and use the super chat feature on YouTube to ask questions. So here's the big story coming out of China, not trade, nothing like that, but this is about gene splicing. And I'm a huge fan of technology and a huge fan of science and huge fan of innovation and progress. And I find this story fascinating and interesting, but it also has to do with kind of, quote, medical ethics and progress and what all that entails. And I find the response to what happened in China interesting. So, at a medical conference, maybe a week ago, at the end of November, a Chinese scientist by the name of He, announced that he had actually used gene splicing on embryos that were then inserted into a woman who carried or maybe these were own embryos, they were her own embryos, and she carried twins to birth. And they were born healthy twins after their genes had been edited pre-birth. Now, this is the first time this had been done. Gene editing of embryos has been done before. For example, an American team just did a gene editing of embryos that seems to have worked. The cells where the genes had been edited duplicated and everything, and then they destroyed the embryos. So what's unique about what is being done in China by this scientist was that they were actually implanted in a woman and she gave birth, and then a few days later he announced that there was another woman who was pregnant with a modified embryo. Now, why did he do this? Well, it turns out that you can modify a particular gene. These were children who were born, whose mother was carried HIV, and they were going to be born infected with the HIV virus. Now, I don't know the science here. This part of the science generally, what do I know? But I'm not a scientist, so one of you might know more about this than I do. But supposedly, by editing the gene, by basically taking out a gene, he made these children resistant to HIV. So he made it possible for them to be born without being susceptible to the HIV virus, which their mother carries. And as a consequence, their mother decided to have the babies, and the father was all excited, and the quote from the father was, he had lost hope for these babies, but now that the babies were protected from HIV, the father sent a message saying he will work hard, earn money, and take care of his two daughters and his wife. Right? So this is massive for this family. Right? Now, so what you can do is, if you identify a genetic problem, or if you identify a susceptibility to a disease, you can supposedly, using this new technique called CRISPR, go in there and edit the genes and fix it. Now, this is being done on adults. This is the difference. On an adult, you can fix the gene, but the genes are then not transmitted to the adult's children. When you do it in an embryo, it means that all the genes in the embryo have now, all the cells in the embryo now have this altered gene, and therefore these genes will be passed on to another generation. So if you have, given the complexity of our genome, not only fixed this problem maybe with HIV, but maybe created new problems, created genetic problems that are currently, given a state of knowledge, unforeseeable, you could have a real mess on your hands in a sense of the consequences of what you could have done to these children. These children could be born with all kinds of other problems. These problems could be passed on to their children. Maybe the problems might not even be observable in the first generation, maybe only observable in the second generation. At least these are the concerns that people are raising. But there is a lot of hoopla about this. By the way, today's news about this story is that the scientist in China has disappeared. And the suspicion is, of course, that the Chinese government has made him disappear because he was an embarrassment to them. What has happened is there's been a huge uproar among scientists in the United States and the rest of the world, including many Chinese scientists, about all the ethical questions this raises. One, did he actually attain consent, proper consent from the parents? Did he actually explain to them all the risks involved in the procedure, the risks involved to the future of these two girls that are born? Did he go through the right protocol? And that's a legitimate issue. It's really, really important when you're doing this kind of science that the patient on which you are, in a sense, experimenting with, know the risk involved. And again, there's some question about that. He says that he went through 2 rounds of informed consent with the parents that lasted a total of 3 hours. The ethicists are saying he shouldn't have done it. He is both his name and it's he. That you should have a third party do it. So, I don't know how important that is, but it's important to get consent. It's important to get objectivity about it. A third party would enhance the objectivity of the process. Again, there's this concern about what would happen. One of the problems is if by taking out the CCR5 gene, which is this HIV gene, you might make the girls more susceptible to other diseases like West Nile virus and influenza. Now, it might be reasonable that might be a reasonable trade-off. But I think the bigger issue is the uncertainty about what other effects they could be. When you change one thing in genes, lots of other things change, and we still don't know enough. So a lot of people are criticizing this, not on the basis of, we should never do this, but more on the basis of we don't know enough yet to be doing this. I don't know how you make that call. I mean, I'm not a scientist engaged enough here, but I don't know how you make that call. And there's no standard here. Right? This is not just a science. By the way, this is not just a Chinese scientist. This is somebody trained in the U.S. His co-authors, his co-scientists, that he's got many published papers, all U.S. scientists. Actually, Rice University is looking into one of his advisor, his PhD advisor, who might have cooperated in this experiment with him. And Rice University might censor this scientist. One of the real issues here, which I think is interesting, really interesting, is that there is no way for people to be penalized if they break these ethics rules. The way they're penalized is through, other scientists ostracize them. Journals don't publish their work. Employers may refuse to hire them. Universities may refuse to fund them. Institutions might refuse to give them grants. But scientists generally, unless there are laws in the country, and there aren't any laws as far as I know, are left free to do these kind of experiments. And as long as there's no deception, they're allowed to do them. So, so I'm really mixed about this. I have mixed feelings about this. On the one hand, wow, this is so cool. So cool. Right? This is the cutting edge of the future. This is where we're heading. You'll be able to engineer your babies. Engineer them free of disease. Engineer them free of certain diseases, at least. Free of susceptibility to certain cancers and to other things. I mean, so cool. So very cool. Gene editing, particularly in vitro, in embryonic stage, is wow. I think it's fantastic. Are we at a state where this is safe to do today? I don't know. I don't necessarily trust the scientific consensus. 97% of all scientists don't think we should be editing genes right now. I don't know, I made that up. Right? But I don't trust scientific consensus about these things. Unless it's really objective. And, I'd be interested in if any of you are scientists in this field and think you have enough of a grasp of the field to say, no, too early, too dangerous, need another 10 years before we actually do this. Or you might say, no, this is cutting edge stuff. It could be done, it's risky, but it could be done, and let's see what happens. This is experimentation on human beings. Risky stuff. So I'm open to both possibilities. I'm excited by it. And let me just give you some perspective, right? Give you some perspectives. In 1980, at the University of California, Los Angeles, Professor Martin Klein was sanctioned by his colleagues and by the university for performing the first gene therapy on two women, one in Israel and one in Italy. And he did it in Israel and Italy because UCLA would not permit it to be done at UCLA. Klein also, like the Chinese guy, announced his work at a conference rather than publishing it in a scientific journal. And as a consequence, faced criticism for trying genetic engineering in people before its safety and effectiveness hadn't yet been established in animals. Of course, today, gene therapy in adults, like what Martin Klein did, is established, still fairly novel, but it's an established treatment method. So he was ahead of his time. He was sanctioned. As far as I know, no damage was caused to anybody who he experimented on. If he had been more conservative, would gene therapy had taken a back seat and been delayed by a few years? Again, don't know enough about the field, but I think it's interesting that we sanction scientists, and yet it might turn out that he, the Chinese scientist, might be well ahead of his time. In 1978, just to give you one more example, and again, I'm not saying that this is what's going to be the case. I don't know enough about it, but I think it's interesting. Here's another example. In 1978, Dr. Robert Edwards was similarly denounced and sanctioned when he announced through the press, not in an academic journal, the world's first test tube baby. Her name was Louise Brown. First test tube baby. Of course, the work that he did, to achieve this earned him a Nobel Prize. And of course, the treatment, IFV, has helped millions and millions and millions of people to have babies, to have children. And, amazingly enough, Louise Brown, who is now 40 years old, is a mother of two sons, conceived the old-fashioned way, completely normal, great. So, will these female twins that Professor He, modified their genes in embryo, will this be the beginning? Or will this be a caution call? Will this have a happy ending, like it did with Robert Edwards, like it did with Martin Klein? Or will it be the beginning of a horror story? Or will the backlash set back gene editing years and years and years? Hard to tell. I don't know. I think it's a story I'm going to be watching, because these are the kind of things that excite me. These cutting edge, at the edge of science. I mean, once CRISPR, this technology that makes gene editing really, really, really easy and cheap, amazingly cheap, was released a few years ago, it has created a revolution. And I think the whole gene editing space, the technology is going to accelerate, and we're going to see more and more and more exciting things in our future. I don't think it's a brave new world. I think it's an exciting new world. It's a world in which we gain even more control over nature. I mean, the story of the human species is a story of ever-growing control over nature, over our environment. And now we are starting to gain control over the ultimate nature, our own nature. And, it's great. Let's have super babies. I have no problem in enhancing this human species artificially and making us better than what nature would create. So, but again, the whole way in which human beings survive is by adapting their nature, the environment, to themselves. And that's what we're doing here. We're adapting human nature, human genome, to what we think is really good for human beings. All right. All right. Just to remind you, I'm taking Super Chat questions available on the Super Chat. All right. Let's. I want to talk a little bit about trade with China. I know I've talked about it endlessly, but Trump and there's a ceasefire in the trade wars. That's how it's been defined, a ceasefire. And there was a fabulous op-ed, very highly recommended, by one of my favorite economists. I've recommended him in the past. His name is John Cochrane. You can find him at grumpyeconomist.com, John Cochrane. I think now he's at the Hoover Institute at Stanford University. Was for many, many years at Chicago. He's actually a finance professor, but really a well-published, really leading economist, and really one of my favorites to read. I think he's fabulous. Anyway, he wrote an op-ed that was published today on The Hill, highly recommend, called "Trump Should Send China Flowers and Not Tariffs." Now, this is a point I've been making all along. The willingness of China to subsidize its goods for U.S. citizens is a massive benefit to the U.S. economy. A massive benefit to the U.S. economy. Not a benefit to China's economy. It hurts China's economy. It's not good for China's economy, but a massive benefit for our economy. And that's where John Cochrane says we should be sending them flowers, chocolates, and nice thank you cards for the gifts they have bestowed upon us. The gift of cheap goods subsidized by Chinese taxpayers. So, somebody asked what school of thought John Cochrane subscribes to. He's really a Chicago economist. He's not an Austrian, although there are some Austrian influences on him. He's really a Chicago economist. But in the school of Milton Friedman and others, but a very, very, very. Go read him. Go read his blog, grumpyeconomist.com. It's excellent. So I thought the fact that somebody else wrote that we should be thankful to the Chinese is worthwhile pointing out, and he explains in simple economic terms why this is good. He says this is just simple arithmetic. This is not hard. And he says, look, of all the problems we have, trade is not a problem. I mean, and he says, like me, maybe I like him because he agrees with me. What do you think? He says the only thing the United States should do with regard to trade is lower tariffs to zero, unilaterally, and then encourage everybody else to mimic us. But, you know, he said we should get a grip, set a standard for good, self-interested, free trade behavior, and work with our allies to get China to obey the same rules. Such a China is far more likely to cooperate on security issues than one already at war with us over trade. So the solution is to lower our tariffs to zero with all of the world, with anybody who wants to send us their goods, and then to work by diplomatic means, by educational means, by the means of teaching them about economics and why they should lower their tariffs to zero as well. A trade war is beyond stupid. Beyond stupid. He says the idea that we can use tariffs to threaten China into freer trade is dangerous. Now, I think it's stupid, but he says it's dangerous. It's hard to credibly threaten to do something that hurts us without denying that it does hurt us, and then get trapped doing it. It took decades to get rid of the trade restrictions placed in the US economy in the 1930s, actually on the global economy in the 1930s. We finally, over the last few decades, have gotten rid of all those restrictions that existed in the 1930s, and now Trump is trying to reverse it. Trade wars against anybody is a bad thing because it hurts us. It doesn't. We are the victim. And China, I've said this many times, China are not communists. Give me a break. By the way, as Cochrane says, there are lots of problems we have in the US economy. Trade is not one of them. If you want to make the US economy more productive, if you want to improve the standard of living and quality of life of Americans, if you want to improve jobs and you want to raise the wages of Americans, then fix healthcare. Eliminate financial regulations. Do away with the obscene tax code that we have. How about doing away with some zoning? How about with occupational licensing? How about getting rid of labor laws? And on, and on, and on. The damaging stuff that we do to ourselves. And this, again, returns me to the point I was making during the campaign. Donald Trump ran on the idea, and he was elected because he ran on this idea, that all our troubles are not our fault. We didn't do this. Chinese did it to us. The immigrants did it to us. The Mexicans did it to us. The Germans did it to us. Then the South Koreans did it to us. We, Americans, are innocent. And yet, it is we who screwed up our healthcare system. Well before Obamacare screwed it up even more. It was we who since 1933 have placed greater and greater and greater and greater regulations on our financial institutions. It's we. Since 1914, the establishment of the income tax have created an obscene, complex, ridiculous, stupid, disincentivizing federal tax code. It is we at the local level who impose on our fellow Americans zoning restrictions that make housing incredibly expensive and distort land use throughout the country. It is we at the state level who imposed occupational licensing, thus restricting the ability of poor people to rise up from poverty because they need a license to shampoo hair or to open a nail salon or to get into hundreds of various professions. Braiding hair, for example. It is we, since the 1930s, who have imposed more and more and more and more labor laws and go on and on and on, and all the damage we, Americans, have done to ourselves. Not China, not Mexico, not immigrants. We, Americans, did it to ourselves. Starting with the progressive presidency of Woodrow Wilson, going through the Great Depression and onwards, we have given ourselves the lousy economy we have. If we want to fix it, don't look to China. Don't look to Mexico. Don't look to immigrants. Fix healthcare. Get rid of financial regulations. Change the tax code. Get rid of zoning. Get rid of occupational licensing. And do away with labor laws. It ain't hard. It's not hard. See why I love John Cochrane? Because he agrees with me. He says, the right approach to trade is simple. Zero tariffs or restrictions. Americans are free to buy from the cheapest and best supplier. Whether foreigners apply tariffs or not is irrelevant to that condition. Now, this is from a great economist, not from just me, PhD in finance, know nothing, Yaron Brook. This is from John Cochrane, PhD in finance from the University of Chicago and a fellow at the Hoover Institute. The trade between countries, he writes, is no different than trade between states. And we all recognize that tariffs between states are a terrible idea. Any money, and I've said this a million times as well, any money that goes to China to buy goods must, this is arithmetic, not economics, just math, come back. It just comes back to a less politically favored industry. It comes back in the form of them buying bonds. In other words, we get their stuff, they get our government bonds. Who's getting a better deal there? This trade stuff, I know, I say it all the time, I talk about it all the time, it infuriates me. And every time I post an article like this on Facebook, the ignorance, I'm sorry, but the ignorance and the sheer stupidity of the comments section underneath drives me nuts. Get government out of telling me who to buy and who not to buy stuff from. Simple. Government has no business telling me how to consume my money and on whom to consume it. So it's a rights issue, but from an economics issue, the moral is the practical. The practical is the moral. What makes sense from a rights perspective is also good economics. Anyway, Trump and Xi met in Argentina and they discussed this, and there's a truce. This is going to be the outcome. The outcome is going to be that China is going to give a few things that are meaningless, and Trump is going to keep some tariffs, and they're going to both declare victory. They're going to both declare that they won, that the war is over, because even Trump, because he's a pragmatist, I guess, and he sees the stock market going down, he realizes that tariffs, well, Trump doesn't realize this, but Trump has economic advisors surrounding him, like Kudlow, who know that tariffs are just stupid policy. And I think he's going to back off of it to some extent, not completely. It's like NAFTA 2.0. Well, really NAFTA 1.2. Nothing radical, nothing dramatic, nothing has changed. It's just shifted the decks a little bit, shifted the chairs, shifted the mixture of regulations and controls over trade between us and Canada and Mexico. We didn't go to zero tariff free trade between the three countries, which is what I would have wanted. We just shifted around which cars can go where, when, under what conditions. That's all. And what labor regulations. Actually, NAFTA 1.2 is actually much more of a leftist NAFTA than the previous NAFTA because there are much stricter labor regulations on the Mexicans as a consequence of NAFTA 1.2, which is what Bernie Sanders and the left have always wanted. Always wanted. They want to impose our labor regulations on the rest of the world. Right. So anyway, I think the damage is going to be contained because the Chinese are too sensible. Trump is alone with, what's his name, Peter Navarro, is the only people, I think, who believes this is somehow of a sensible. Now, Kudlow is a pathetic economist, but on this issue, you know, he basically is a guy who goes with the wind, but on this issue, he knows that the tariffs, and he's got the president's ear, and that's what matters. So I think we're going to see a movement away from tariffs, at least for a while, so that we get a, you know, it's less likely we go into a deep recession, which I think is what we would do if we got into a serious trade war with the Chinese, if this was taken seriously. All right, remind you again, Super Chat is available. I am available to take your questions. Let me take these two questions from Patreon contributors, and then we'll call it a night. The first one is, and this one I'm only going to give a partial answer because I haven't really prepped it, and it needs some thought, and I need to make a proper list. But Lewis asks, please list your top 10 favorite books on economics, which someone should read in order to gain a decent understanding of economic theory and practice. All right, so I'll give you a few books. I'm not going to give you a comprehensive list. I'll have to think about what my top 10 would be, because I don't think what I'm going to give you now is going to actually be 10. It's going to be less than that. I would definitely read, as my first book on Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt. I think it's the most important one. It's easy, and it's a fantastic read. And it'll give you a good basis on which to approach other books in economics. If you're ambitious, then you should read von Mises, Ludwig von Mises. Try to find older printings of his books. I don't trust the more modern printings of his books by the Mises Institutes. Try to find non-Mises Institute printings of the books. But his book on socialism, on economic calculation, his book on, of course, human action, although I would skip the first 70 to 90 pages. So that would be a good start, right? I would, for a beginner, with a lot of caveats, I would definitely read Milton Friedman's books on economics. I think there are two of them, and I apologize, I forget their names right now. Just because I think they explain like issues like free trade simply, in very simple terms. I think Thomas Sowell's work is pretty good. Again, it's got a lot of problems with it, but again, he explains simple economic ideas very, very well. So Thomas Sowell's Basic Economics is a good book. It's not as good as Economics in One Lesson, but again, he gives different examples, but it's just not as solidly placed as Economics in One Lesson is. So Thomas Sowell's Basic Economics is also worth reading. Free to Choose by Milton Friedman, and there's one of his books has got capitalism in the title. Capitalism and Freedom, thank you. And then, if you really want to go deep, if you really want to try to understand economics, Carl Menger's material, I think he's philosophically the best of the Austrian economists. He actually has an Aristotelian view of the Austrian economists. Okay. if you want to delve deeper into Austrian economics, von Bauweg, who is another Austrian economist, I would read some of the articles written. Hayek is very mixed. Philosophically, he's a disaster. His economics are pretty good, so you could read some of Hayek's economics. That's a good start, but I will definitely have to do the research and the work to get you a top 10 kind of list. I will do that. Of course, everybody should be reading a new textbook of Americanism, which is Jonathan Hoenig just published, and you can find it on Amazon in every format known to man. We will have Jonathan on the show, I think it's next week, to talk about the book. And there's some great stuff. It's a great stocking stuffer. And there's some new material there by Ayn Rand from her seminars on politics. Of course, the textbook on Americanism, which she published, she never really published it, so that's also really new material, first time out there. And an essay by me, and Jonathan, and Greg Salamieri, and Onkar, Gate, and Ilan Juno, and a bunch of other objectivists. So great book for Christmas. Everybody should have it. I should have my copy is somewhere here. I could show it. It's way back there. Wait a minute. Here it is. Signed. Right? If you get yours, then I can sign it for you, because this is one of those books that I actually sign. And of course, Jonathan would sign it to you. So if you buy the book, and then come to one of my events, maybe I'll do an event with Jonathan, and we'll sign it. How about that? All right. Bertie asks, is the state growing in control inevitable? No, nothing's inevitable. It's not inevitable. It's an issue of ideas. We live in a world in which the dominant ideas are about, necessitate the growth of the state. Whether it's altruism or collectivism, or the ideas in economics, like the stupid ideas about trade, that where the belief is that you should you need central planners in order to guide the economy. So the battle is a battle of ideas, and there's nothing inevitable about a battle of ideas. Good ideas can win, but we need to fight for them. And my concern is there's not enough of us fighting. There's not enough people engaged in the battle. And that is the problem. I forgot a book on economics, of course, George Reisman's Capitalism. This massive book makes human action looks like a little book on economics, which I would recommend. All right. What else? Yeah, I think we're done for the day. It's an hour. An hour is good. I don't think we need more than an hour. All right. Thanks, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the show today. As you know, you should be sharing the shows, and you should subscribe to my YouTube channel. And you can do that very simply if you're watching on YouTube. If you're not, if you're on Facebook, you can go to YouTube and subscribe to the Yaron Brook channel. And love your support on Patreon. That would be fantastic. And it's the Christmas season. It's the season of giving. Here, you're not just giving like you would give to charity. You're giving actually for the pursuit of your own values, for the continuation of the show, for us to be advocating for the ideas that have the potential to actually turn the United States around, turn the world around, make the world a much better place to live. So by contributing to the Yaron Brook Show on Patreon, you would be significantly helping to bring about a much better world in the future. Okay. And right. Thanks for the support. I appreciate it. Thank you for all of those of you who contribute through Patreon. Thank you for those of you who are going to, as a consequence of listening to the show on a regular basis, and those of you who value what we offer here. All right, thanks everybody. I'll try to do a show from New York, but if not, definitely on Saturday